Good evening, everybody. I was going to call people to order with the bell, but I just took it out and everybody got quiet. I'd like to welcome you to the final Contemplative Studies event of this academic year. My name's Hal Roth. I'm the director of the Contemplative Studies Initiative and Concentration. And I'd like to thank a number of people who've been associated with bringing our speaker tonight, Professor Richie Davidson, to Brown. First of all, I'd like to thank the School of Public Health, particularly Fox Weddle, the director, Chris Kaler, and Eric Laux for their part in arranging the visit of Professor Davidson. Also, tomorrow, Professor Davidson will be lecturing at the School of Public Health at noon at 121 South Main Street, room 245, on the topic of order and disorder in the emotional brain, implications for well-being. I'd also like to thank the Hershey Family Foundation for their donations to contemplative studies and other donors. And I'd also like to thank Ann Hart and Nicole Vadney, contemplative studies administrators who've been very helpful in doing the arrangements for this. Of course, I'd also like to thank our students and our concentrators over the years who've really driven us to get better and better, or attempt to get better and better. I want to mention to you that Contemplative Studies has a series of courses that we're running this summer in the summer school. We call it the Contemplative Studies Summer Intensive. For more information, either go to the summer school catalog or go to our website. We also have, and we're announcing just this week, a series of contemplative practice grants for our undergraduates, graduate, and medical students. These grants will help subsidize students to go on contemplative practice retreats this summer. For more information, please go to our Contemplative Studies website. I'd like to begin by asking for a moment of silence for the people of Nepal who've been really very seriously affected by a major earthquake this weekend. If you would like to donate to earthquake relief, please, there are two websites that you can get more information on where to donate. One is our Contemplative Studies website, and another is the website for the Office for Global Engagement. Contemplative studies is a new academic field, multidisciplinary academic field, that we've been working to develop here at Brown, that brings the perspectives of the humanities, particularly religious studies and philosophy of mind, together with those of the brain sciences, to focus on research and teaching on the nature of an important range of human experiences of concentration, tranquility, and insight. Such experiences occur on a spectrum, from spontaneous absorption in an activity to the deliberately cultivated experiences that occur within meditation traditions. They yield not only transient states, but longer-lasting transformations in cognitive and emotional traits that can have important positive influences. The existence, much less the significance, of this spectrum of experiences for individual and social transformation has heretofore not been fully appreciated. We think it is worthy of its own field of academic inquiry. Within this field, we have also developed a unique approach that we call integrative contemplative pedagogy. This balances traditional, objective, at a distance, third-person perspectives with what we call a critical first-person perspective that emphasizes a direct engagement with contemplative practices within their cognitive and historical settings, without the requirement of belief in their veridicality that often accompanies engaging them in religious contexts. This type of balanced inquiry between third-person and first-person perspectives is at the heart of the most innovative research Professor Davidson has advanced throughout his career. Our speaker tonight, Richie Davidson, is the William James and Vilas Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and Director of the Waisman Institute for Brain Imaging and Behavior and the Laboratory for Effective Neuroscience, and the founder and chair of the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Born and raised in New York City, he attained a bachelor's degree in psychology at NYU and a PhD at Harvard in psychology, where he was mentored by David McClelland and Gary Schwartz, and also a little bit by Danny Goleman. He began his academic career at SUNY Purchase, and in 1984 moved to the University of Wisconsin, where he's been for the past 30 years plus. Professor Davidson is the author and co-author of more than a dozen books and more than 250 scientific articles, including the recent co-authored volume, The Emotional Life of the Brain. Professor Davidson's research is focused on cortical and subcortical substrates of emotional and affective disorders, including depression and anxiety, and on the identification of emotional styles and ameliorative practices. A major focus of his work has been the interactions between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and the regulation of emotion. Professor Davidson's research has significantly advanced the theory and methods of neurophenomenology, a research technique originally developed by the late Francisco Varela that combines the third-person research tools of neuroscience, including brain activity measuring devices such as PET scans and fMRI, with the simultaneous first-person reports of expert subjects, including advanced Tibetan Buddhist practitioners whom he has often described as the Olympic athletes of meditation, and also of novice meditators. The resulting research suggests that the human brain is quite plastic, that repeated practices such as meditation can fundamentally alter its activity and even its morphology, suggesting that such important life skills as compassion and happiness can be deliberately taught and cultivated. He's been a pioneer in working towards broadening our understanding of human consciousness and its potential through careful research into contemplative traditions that have cultivated unique psychological methods of critical self-observation and other regarding social virtues. The recipient of numerous awards from his peers in academic fields, Professor Davidson was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential persons in 2006, after which it was apparently all downhill from there. Please join me in giving a warm, brown welcome to Professor Richie Davidson.
Thank you, Han. It's wonderful to be here at Brown. Again, we just discovered that I was here last 10 years ago. It really feels like it was sooner. And tonight's lecture, I should just say, for those of you who have heard me before, is going to be Richie Unplugged. And so I'm not using slides tonight. For those who want a more scientific talk, I'm giving one tomorrow. I want to begin by situating the work that we've been doing and just saying a little bit about my own history and where all this began. As Hal mentioned, I'm a psychologist and a neuroscientist by training. And I was really lucky in the early part of my career to, by chance, encounter a number of people whose presence and whose demeanor was infectious to me. These were the kind of people who are very warm-hearted and kind, the kind of people I really wanted to spend more time around, and they were not the people I met in the academy, with all due respect. They were people I was lucky enough to meet on the outside, and they impressed me with a number of their characteristics, and they also shared in common an interest in and a practice of meditation. And this led me, after my second year of graduate school at Harvard, to go to India. I went to India for the first time in 1974 and tasted a little bit of what this tradition was about. And I came back, much to the amazement of some of the Harvard faculty who thought I would never come back. I was pretty convinced that I would return. I came back with a fervent conviction that this work was relevant to mainstream science, to psychology, and to the just then emerging neuroscience, But it was made very clear to me that if I wanted a successful career in science, this was a terrible way to begin with an interest in this area. And so I dutifully respected the advice of my advisors, and I pursued a career studying the brain and emotion, which I still very much do today. And the work that we've been doing in what we've been calling these days contemplative science or contemplative neuroscience is very much within the rubric of work on emotion, because some of the key targets of contemplative training indeed is a transformation of emotion. And so this umbrella is really an appropriate umbrella in which to embed this work. So I actually, if you go back and look carefully at my early publications, you'll actually see a few papers in the late 1970s and early 1980s on meditation. We dabbled in this area very early on, but the methods that we had available and the zeitgeist was simply not up to the job. I then dropped research in this area, and I became a closet meditator for 20 years. I think it's fair to say that most of my professional colleagues in psychology and neuroscience really didn't know about my interest in this area, and I quietly pursued my own personal practice and found a lot of benefit from it, but really kept it very much in the background and under the radar. All of that changed in 1992. And in 1992, I had a meeting which was to transform my life. And to quote my dear friend John Kabat-Zinn, my life went through an orthogonal rotation. The meeting was with the Dalai Lama. He invited me to meet with him at his residence in India, along with a couple of other scientists, and he wanted to encourage us to pursue serious neuroscientific research on the minds and the brains of Tibetan practitioners who have spent years cultivating their mind. And I was deeply inspired by his message, and also he was quite challenging to me. And he said, look, you've been using tools of modern neuroscience to study anxiety and depression and fear. Why can't you use those same tools to study kindness and compassion? And I had no good answer for him other than it is hard. But you know, when we first began to study fear and anxiety, that was hard too. And I think most scientists would agree we've made at least some progress in our understanding of the brain mechanisms associated with those conditions. There's no fundamental reason in principle why we can't do the same for virtuous qualities of the mind. And I made a commitment to His Holiness on that day in 1992, two things. One is that I was going to come out of the closet with my interest in this area. And the second was that I was going to do everything I could to put compassion, to put kindness and other virtuous qualities squarely within the crosshairs of modern science. And since that time in 1992, that is the direction toward which our work has been oriented. And in 2009, as Hal mentioned in his gracious introduction, we established this center at the University of Wisconsin called the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds, where all this work gets done. And so that's what we've been doing. And the reason why this work is, I think, enabled in modern times, and why our work, and not just our work, but the work of many other scientists, including wonderful scientists here. My friend Willoughby Britton is in the audience carrying on this work here at Brown, and a number of other scientists throughout the country. There are four factors, four major themes in modern science that I'd like to explicitly name that have been, I think, importantly responsible for providing the underpinning of this work and allowing it to go forward in the way it has. So let me name those themes and say a little bit about each. The first is neuroplasticity. Many of you, I'm sure all of you, have heard that word. It simply means that the brain is built to change in response to experience and in response to training. And much of modern neuroscience, in fact, is dedicated to uncovering the many different mechanisms of plasticity. And this has been a vibrant research area, and it's one that we can take advantage of in the work that we do in contemplative neuroscience to investigate how the engagement in specific kinds of mental practices can actually harness the mechanisms of neuroplasticity and change the brain in ways that may be beneficial. So that's the first concept. The second is the equivalent, in many ways, of neuroplasticity in the realm of genomics. And this is epigenetics, the study of how genes are regulated. And we know from hard-nosed biological research today that gene expression and epigenetic changes can be induced through experience in the world. We know that the behavior of a mother toward her offspring can induce epigenetic changes in that offspring which persist for the entire duration of the life of that organism, and new work suggests actually can be passed down for at least 1 or 2 or even 3 generations. These epigenetic changes have been found in many different systems, including in specific neural circuits that play an important role in modulating our emotional behavior. So these systems are much more plastic than we thought. We're all born with a fixed complement of base pairs that constitute our DNA, but we can think of many genes as having little volume controls that regulate the extent to which those genes are expressed. And the mechanisms of expression are highly experience dependent and may be responsive to certain kinds of mental training. We published a study in 2014 where we brought long-term meditation practitioners into the laboratory for a day of intensive practice. We took blood samples before and after 8 hours of practice, and we showed systematic epigenetic changes within the course of 8 hours, changes in gene expression in a number of genes that specifically, in this case, these are from peripheral blood mononuclear cells. We're specifically looking at genes involved in inflammation. And we saw systematic changes in gene expression in these genes that are, we know, to be implicated in mechanisms of inflammation. These are changes that we see over the course of just 8 hours. So this study is really a proof of concept in illustrating that these changes can actually happen on a very rapid time scale and can be induced through purely mental practice. We had a control group come in for a day of leisure in the laboratory where they had the same level of physical activity. They were fed the same diet. They read and they watched quiet videos for the whole day, but they did not engage in contemplative practice. And they didn't show anything remotely like these changes. So again, proof of concept illustrating that epigenetics is going to be another big domain that is centrally relevant to this work. The third theme that I'd like to name is the increased understanding of the bidirectional highways that exist between the brain and the body. Specific pathways through which signals from the brain communicate with the body and signals from the body provide upstream information to the brain. Contemplative practices are embodied practices. They don't just change the mind and the brain, they also change the body. And we also know that most of these traditions include specific practices that work on the body itself, and through changes in the body can induce changes in the brain through upstream signaling from different organ systems to the brain. There are specific circuits in the brain that are critical in monitoring the milieu of the body. We know, for example, that the insula, a region of cortex, is critically important. It's the only area of the brain that has a viscerotopic map. It has a map that is a topographic map of the different visceral organs in the body, and it's through the insula that upstream information from the body gets conveyed to different neural systems, and also the brain can then, in a downstream fashion, in a top-down fashion, influence these different visceral organs. Now, this work is going to open up a whole new territory. We know from a lot of basic kind of epidemiological research, from areas like in health psychology, that there are various kinds of socio-demographic, socio-emotional factors which are associated with different health outcomes. We know, for example, that psychosocial stress can exacerbate the symptoms of many different physical illnesses. If that is the case, if we accept that as fact, those psychosocial influences are presumably transduced by the brain. They don't just directly affect the body. They have to go through the brain, and through the interpretation of those signals in the brain and through downstream signaling, they can then influence these bodily systems in a way that would exacerbate the symptoms. Well, if it goes in one direction, it's likely to go in the other direction as well. And that is, if we cultivate healthy habits of mind, salubrious states of mind, can we influence our peripheral biology in ways that may be health promoting? In 2003, we published what I believe was the first randomized controlled trial ever published of mindfulness-based stress reduction, a very popular 8-week secular mindfulness meditation program that's taught all over the world now, including here at Brown. And we did this with employees at a high-tech corporation in Madison, Wisconsin. Participants were randomized to an MBSR group or a control group, and the intervention began in September, and it was over around Thanksgiving. And at the end of the intervention, we gave everyone in the MBSR group and in the control group a flu vaccine. And we took blood samples before and after the vaccine was given so that we were able to calculate the antibody titers mounted in response to the vaccine. And this provided us with a quantitative index of the extent to which the vaccine was working. And we found that after just 8 weeks of mindfulness practice, the antibody response to influenza vaccine among the meditators was significantly larger than among the controls, suggesting that these practices are not just influencing the mind and the brain, but they're also influencing the body in ways that may, in fact, be health promoting. So I've named 3 themes. The first is neuroplasticity. The second was epigenetics. The third was these bidirectional highways that exist between the brain and the body. The fourth theme is the most controversial of all these, of this group. I would say the evidence is compelling for the first 3 themes. The fourth theme really represents a relatively more recent area of research, but one that I am particularly passionate about. And I will name the theme in a provocative way. The fourth theme is that we as human beings come into the world with innate basic goodness. I'll say it again. Human beings come into the world with innate basic goodness. Now, what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that we come into the world with a bias, a preference for altruistic and warm-hearted encounters compared to those that are selfish and aggressive. And we can show this in a hard-nosed scientific way. So, for example, if young infants are exposed to video stimuli that depict cooperative, altruistic, and warm-hearted encounters compared to videos that are matched on physical characteristics, compared to stimuli that depict selfish and aggressive encounters, infants will prefer to look at the warm-hearted encounters. They prefer the warm-hearted encounters. And we can ask them by monitoring their eye movements. So you can ask a 3 or a 6-month-old infant which it prefers by carefully monitoring their eye movements with infrared eye tracking so that you can precisely quantitate how much time they are looking at different categories of stimuli. And the data very clearly show that very young infants strongly prefer to look at the warm-hearted, cooperative encounters compared to those that are selfish and aggressive. And so one of the really interesting things is that in many of these contemplative traditions, there is an assumption that when we engage in practices to cultivate compassion, for example, and to cultivate loving kindness toward others, that we're not actually creating these psychological states de novo, but rather we are discovering, if you will, as it's said in these traditions, we are discovering the fundamental true nature of our own minds. We are going back, if you will, to our fundamental roots and sort of peeling away some of the gunk which has gotten in the way of us clearly seeing that this is indeed who we are and the way we come into the world. And so it's not as if we're creating these things out of nowhere, but rather we are nurturing and strengthening these qualities that have already been present. One way to think about compassion is very much like language. We are all born, unquestionably, with a predisposition for language. However, the evidence clearly suggests that in order for that innate propensity to flourish, it requires the presence of a linguistic community. We know from case studies of feral children who are born in the wild that if they are not surrounded by a normal linguistic community, language does not develop properly, normally. And I think we can consider compassion in the same way, very much like language. We're all born with an innate predisposition for compassion and kindness. And it requires, though, the presence of the right kind of supportive community in order for those seeds to flourish. So the fourth theme is this theme of innate basic goodness. So just to return to the biographical narrative for a moment. So in 1992, I met the Dalai Lama. It took us a few years to ramp up, and then we began to do all this research. And I'd like to share with you a little bit about that work. It's several different facets. I've already mentioned some. And also say a little bit about well-being more specifically. The title of this talk, I think, is Well-being is a Skill. Normally, we don't think about well-being and happiness as skills. But I would like to invite you to consider that all of the evidence that we now have suggests that this is the right way to think about it. It is a skill that is fundamentally no different than learning how to play the violin or learning to play sports. If you practice at it, you will get better. The circuits in the brain that are associated with these qualities exhibit plasticity in the same way that motor circuits exhibit plasticity and show changes with physical exercise. There is each year for the last several years, the United Nations has issued a World Happiness Report. This year, actually it was just released, this year, 2015 report was just released on April 24th, last Friday, at a news conference in New York. And in previous years, this report was written by 3 economists. It is kind of humorous. They're wonderful economists. The lead author is Jeffrey Sachs, who is director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And this year, they decided they'd ask me to be a co-author. First time a non-economist has helped with this report. And so we were specifically tasked with presenting the neuroscientific evidence on happiness and well-being. And it was a wonderful opportunity to reflect on the field and to consider some of the neuroscientific elements or constituents, if you will, that have been neuroscientifically supported that we can say about well-being. And I'd like to just go through 4 constituents of well-being that we discussed in this UN World Happiness Report. And it relates to a lot of the research that we're doing, so it'll provide an opportunity to discuss the work in that context. So these are all 4 constituents of well-being which are not talked about actively in the psychological well-being literature, but these are all elements which are grounded in neuroscientific research. And some of them come from research that relates to some of the emotional styles that I discuss in the book that Hal mentioned of mine, The Emotional Life of Your Brain. So one of the constituents we call resilience, and we define resilience in a very specific way. Resilience is the rapidity with which you recover from adversity. The rapidity with which you recover from adversity. And we can measure resilience in specific brain systems. And we can measure how long it takes for certain patterns of neural activity to come back down to baseline. And let me give you an experiment that in part relates to that, in part addresses another related issue that we did with long-term meditation practitioners. And this is an opportunity to discuss the work that His Holiness the Dalai Lama encouraged us to do. It seems like in order to study virtuous qualities of mind, you also have to study suffering. You know, it's said in the traditional texts that there's an inextricable link between samsara and nirvana. Well, it seems like in research that's true as well. And so in order to discover virtuous qualities of mind, you often have to figure out ways to ethically and safely torture people. So we do that in our laboratory. And one of the ways we do that is with physical pain. Physical pain is something that we all encounter in the real world, and this is actually a very ecologically valid kind of stimulus. And so we can deliver physical pain very, very safely using heat, and we deliver it with a thermode. It's essentially a metal plate that's very thin through which extremely rapid circulating water goes, and we can regulate the temperature of that water very, very precisely to 1/10 of a degree centigrade. And because the water circulates so rapidly, we can do it on a very fast time scale. So we can change the temperature very, very quickly. So, and also we can do this while a person is in the MRI scanner. So here's the experiment. I'll just describe the key details. We bring a person into the laboratory and we test their pain thresholds and we give them a few experiences of this really intensely painful stimulus. And it really is intensely painful. It really feels like your skin is burning, but we can do it in a way that's safe. And in the experiment, after they've gotten a few hits of this, we present a cue which simply denotes that a painful stimulus will be coming in 10 seconds. So they get like a tone, beep. And then 10 seconds later, they get zapped. So imagine if we take a person off the street who has no specific kind of mind training, we bring them into the laboratory, we allow them to experience this painful stimulus, and we then give them this cue, and we tell them the cue means that in 10 seconds you're going to get zapped. What do you think happens when we present the cue? Well, right. So when we present the cue, scientists have learned a lot about the pain matrix in the brain that's activated in response to a noxious, painful stimulus. And it turns out that when we present this cue, no pain, nothing noxious, but just the cue, the circuits in the brain that are associated with pain begin to activate. And they activate as strongly as if the real pain were presented. And even though nothing is happening other than they got a cue. And then they get the pain. And then after the painful stimulus terminates, there is a recovery period. And it turns out that if you take the average person off the street, the brain circuits that respond to the pain continue to activate after the painful stimulus goes off. So they have a very slow recovery, even if they're told they're not going to be presented with any more painful stimuli. It's as if they can't help but think about it, but ruminate about it. Just turn over and over in their mind how terrible it was. And it turns out that reports of distress and suffering are largely associated with the neural activity in the period before the painful stimulus occurred and in the period after the painful stimulus went off. Not so much during the painful stimulus itself. Now, in the very long-term meditation practitioners, and these are practitioners who have an average length of lifetime practice of 34,000 hours. So you can go do the arithmetic at home, but 34,000 hours is a big number. And so these are extremely long-term practitioners. And among these long-term practitioners, when we present this initial cue, very little changes in the brain. When the heat actually comes on, they show a huge response. And in certain areas of the brain, it's actually significantly larger than what the controls show. It's as if their sense doors are totally open and responsive. And then after the painful stimulus ends, they come rapidly back down to baseline. And that may be a very adaptive profile of responding. They are fully present for what's happening, but they don't ruminate about the past and they don't worry about the future. So getting back to this UN happiness report, the first constituent of well-being that we talked about was resilience, which is the ability to rapidly recover following adversity. The second characteristic of well-being we described is another emotional style that I talk about in my book, which is the capacity to have certain kinds of positive emotions persist. In many ways, it's the flip side of resilience. And we can look at the world with a positive kind of glow. And it turns out that this makes a really important difference for well-being. And this is a particular quality which is abnormal in patients who suffer from major depression. Patients who suffer from major depression, in studies that we've published from our lab, when you present an acute positive stimulus, the neural response in the areas in the brain that concern themselves with this sort of thing actually show activation that's comparable to what a non-depressed individual displays. But that activation is very short-lived. It's very fleeting. It does not persist. Whereas in healthy controls and in individuals who have high levels of well-being, that activity persists over time. So the first constituent was resilience. The second is what we've called outlook, the ability for positive emotion to persist. The third constituent has to do with a third emotional style that I talk about, which is attention. Now, attention is kind of an anomaly to be referred to as having to do with emotion, but it does. And let me just tell you one way in which it does. There was a study that was published a few years ago in Science, major scientific publication, from a group at Harvard, a bunch of friends of mine, social psychologists, where they sampled people in the real world using smartphones, and they took advantage of smartphone technology to collect data from thousands of people. And they basically asked people 3 questions as they went about their daily lives. The first question is, from a list of activities, just simply tell us what you're doing right now. Second question, where's your mind right now? Is it focused on what you're doing, or is it focused elsewhere? And the third question was, how happy or unhappy are you right now, at this moment? Those are the 3 questions. And here's what they found. They found that the average American adult spends 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what they're doing. 47% of the time. Now that's an astounding observation. I mean, it doesn't surprise us. We're a nation that suffers collectively from a massive attention deficit disorder on a large scale. But it's sobering. The invitation in this work is that we can do better. 47%, we can do better. This is something that I am just thoroughly convinced of. And the data from simple contemplative practices, if there's one area where there's really good scientific evidence, it's in the domain of attention. William James, in his classic 2-volume tome in 1890, has a chapter, a full chapter that he dedicates to attention. And in that chapter, he said something very profound. And the first time I read this, it just sent tingles through me, and still does. And he said this. He said, the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui if he have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. And then he went on to say, but it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about. I think that if William James had more contact with the contemplative traditions, he would have instantaneously seen that if nothing else, these were strategies and methods to educate attention. And even if we can make a 5% difference in that number, just imagine a world where we were actually more present, where we actually paid attention to those around us, to the environment around us, and particularly if we did it with a kind of positive perspective. Just envision a world in the future where that is a possibility. I think it is. And I think that we all have a responsibility to do everything we can to see that these strategies and methods become more widely available, because they don't take anything special to cultivate. All they take is the presence of a human mind. We can do this anywhere, anytime. And it doesn't take much to show some benefit. So this third dimension of well-being is attention. And when we are paying attention, when we are focused on what we're doing, we report ourselves to be happier. So the other finding from this study is when people reported that they were not paying attention to what they were doing, they were chronically unhappy. They were dysphoric. And so positive emotion and attention are intimately intertwined. There have been studies of the concept of flow. Some of you may have heard of flow. It's kind of when you're really in the groove and paying attention and fully focused on what you're doing. And there's a very well-known psychologist by the name of Csikszentmihalyi who has pioneered the study of flow. And he's studied individuals who've gone to great extremes to be in this flow state. People like rock climbers, Rock climbers are particularly interesting because that is an activity where any a lapse of attention can potentially be lethal. And so it's interesting to reflect on why is it that individuals place themselves in this kind of mortal danger. Why do people choose to engage in these kinds of activities? The reason why, I would like to suggest, is precisely because it feels good to be focused. It feels good to be in the groove in this way. And some people have found that it helps to go to these great extremes in order to get focused. But the invitation from these contemplative traditions is that you don't need to be a rock climber. In fact, one of the reasons why many of these traditions often start with the breathing is paying attention to breathing. Breathing, I mean, let's be honest, it's not a very interesting stimulus. But if you can pay attention to your breathing, you can pay attention to virtually anything. And so it's probably very helpful to start with a kind of stimulus that's not drawing our attention. It's not pulling our attention, but rather we can settle our attention onto it. It's not stimulus-driven attention, but rather it's more self-directed. So the fourth component of well-being that's been studied neuroscientifically may be a surprise to some of you, but that fourth component is generosity. There's now a growing scientific literature that suggests that one of the very best ways to activate circuits in the brain that we know to be associated with positive emotion is through generosity, and to activate them in ways that are enduring. And it expresses, there are studies where direct measurements of the brain have been made, and also studies where it's been looked at behaviorally. And there are social psychologists who've done crazy studies where people come into the laboratory in the morning and they're given a wad of money, $50. And they said, this is an unusual experiment. These were done with students, $50 was a lot of money. And they're told, look, we know that everyone has things that they've wanted to buy for themselves, but they can never justify sort of frivolous presents for themselves. Here's $50. Go buy whatever you'd like for yourself. The only constraint is that you have to spend all the money on yourself. And then come back to the lab at the end of the day. Another group of people, and these are randomly assigned, are given $50, and they're told, what we'd like you to do is go buy gifts for other people. The only constraint is that you not spend a penny on yourself, but you use all the money to buy gifts for others, and then simply come back to the lab at the end of the day. And guess which group reports much higher levels of happiness and well-being? Of course, the group who are spending money on others. And there's a lot of other evidence like this. And so generosity is probably the simplest and most direct route to activate these circuits in the brain. So those are four important constituents of well-being that have been studied in a hard-nosed neuroscientific way. So let me, in the next 2 minutes, just share with you, and then we'll have time for questions, just say that one of the major foci of our translational work these days is taking this work out into the community. And we've developed a kindness curriculum for preschool kids, as I mentioned, I think. I'm not sure I mentioned it here. But in any case, we have this curriculum that we're studying. And there's a huge opportunity with children because their brains at particular developmental periods are more plastic. And interventions can perhaps endure, the impact can endure more if they are provided to children at these young ages. And so we see this as an area of tremendous opportunity in the future, and one that can make an enormous difference in our culture. James Heckman, the Nobel laureate in economics, did analyses where he's estimated that for every $1 that we invest in high-quality preschool intervention, there's a return of $7 on that investment by the time the individual is 30 years of age. And so these are the kinds of things that really are penny wise and pound foolish not to be doing and are desperately needed in our culture. So I will end there. I want to thank you all for your wonderful attention, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Since we are filming this event, it would be very helpful if you go to microphones and queue up at the microphones if you'd like to ask questions. This will be put up online next week, along with, I think we have 8 or 9 other recordings of our lectures from this academic year, and many more from past years.
And while we're waiting for people to queue up for questions, let me just take this opportunity to express my gratitude to Hal for the invitation and also for the amazing work that he and his colleagues are doing here at Brown. You guys are really lucky to have the only contemplative studies concentration that I know of at the undergraduate level. I've interacted with a number of graduates from this program, and it's really just a testament to the incredible devotion and programming that exists here. So it's really impressive, and may it flourish and continue.
Thank you. Is this close enough for the microphone? Thank you very much. It was a very interesting lecture. I do a modality called craniosacral therapy. And during that time, people are in meditative states, have different emotional experiences as well as peaceful feelings. And have you ever done any of the brain scans before and after certain body works?
We haven't. I think it would be really interesting to do. It's one has limited bandwidth, and so we just haven't done it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I know there's a lot of research on the subject of expert meditators and resilience, and you alluded to that. But I was wondering if there was research, if you were aware of research, because I personally don't know, regarding expert meditators and outlook and that after effect after a positive stimuli.
Yeah, so looking at the sort of lingering effects of a positive stimulus in long-term practitioners, there's some work that where specific conditions are relevant to that in an experiment that one can pull out. One of the things about long-term practitioners is that, and I'll answer it with a story, many of these practitioners are in that kind of state all the time. So let me tell you, so it's hard to see a change. Let me tell you a story which illustrates this. I was once in Dharamsala with the Dalai Lama, and they were just in the room. It was just me and the Dalai Lama and this crazy Japanese scientist who I had just met. And this Japanese scientist leans over and he said, "Your Holiness, can you please tell us the time in your life when you were the most happy?" And I thought, gee, that was a really interesting question. And just like that, His Holiness said, "I think right now." So it makes it challenging. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been really wonderful. I'm interested in the implications of your research on early childhood education. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the study, the epigenetic study and gene expression, and anything specific about the behavior of the mothers impacting the offspring.
Yeah, I should actually, for the sake of honest disclosure, Those studies, first of all, they're not our studies. Secondly, they're done in animals. And they're done in animals because you cannot look directly at gene expression changes in the brain because you need to actually look at brain tissue. I mean, there are ways to sort of get at this using crazy new technology today, but those studies were done in animals. And the behavior of the mother that was specifically looked at in these were studies done in rodents. And the behavior of the mothers were licking and grooming. Probably not a bad thing for humans to do either. And so what was found is that those mothers who engaged in increased licking and grooming induced an epigenetic change in their offspring. And it was directly correlated with the amount of licking and grooming that the mother provided. And these were studies where they were cross-fostered so that there was no genetic relationship between the mother and the offspring that she was interacting with. So it was purely an environmentally produced effect.
And right at the end of your talk, you mentioned application in preschool, early childhood education. And is there anything more that you might add about that?
Well, you know, I think that this is going to be a very vibrant area, and I think that there's enormous opportunity here. And we know from modern research that a child's capacity to delay his or her gratification at age 4 and 5 is a very strong predictor of major life outcomes when they're in their 30s. And qualities like delay of gratification trump IQ, they trump SAT scores, and they trump grade point average in predicting major life outcomes. So these studies all control for those factors. And kids who have higher levels of self-control at age 4 and 5, as young adults, turn out to have fewer instances of drug abuse, better physical health, increased financial success. Kids who are at the lowest end of the continuum on self-control actually have significantly higher level of adult criminal convictions by the time they're 32 years of age. So this is, these qualities really matter in terms of life outcomes. So if we can influence these processes early on in life, I think that we can actually change the course of development. Small changes early on can then have a multiplicative ripple as the children develop. So I think that this is going to be a very vibrant area. It needs a lot more work. No one's going to believe this from one study that's done, you know, with 200 kids in Madison, Wisconsin. We need to have a large-scale national effort to implement this across the nation in a very rigorous way, collecting data on literally 2 orders of magnitude more than we've collected to really see whether these things matter, these kinds of interventions, and also using the data to tweak the interventions. One of the things that I often say is, which I really believe, is that one size does not fit all. And I think that scientists can help to come up with a battery of assessment tools to assess a person's emotional and cognitive style, and then offer practices which may be more optimally matched to a child or an adult's cognitive and emotional style so that they're more efficacious. So I think that that's another area that is going to be an important one. Thank you.
There's a tremendous synchronicity in my being here today and the fact that just recently good friends recommended to me this book called The Magic. It's 28 days of exercises based on gratitude that you do at night, in the morning, during the day. I'm up to day 10, and I'm already experiencing amazing shifts.
Wonderful.
Including getting close to forgiving my soon-to-be ex-wife.
Amazing. Wonderful. It's the kind of real-world data we need. That's great. Thank you.
Hi, two questions. I guess I understand the federal government is putting big money into saving brains of veterans who have PTSD, volunteer their brains, and big money in storing these brains and studying them. Is there any such similar effort in terms of meditators donating their brains to your science? Question number one. Question number two, while I would be very interested to know how many hours per day you meditate, cognitively speaking, is there an optimal number of hours that one could say this is optimal or not optimal for my brain body to be meditating?
Wonderful set of questions. So let me take them in turn. In terms of brain bank, it's a great question, and I've actually been advocating for a meditation brain bank of exactly the sort that you're describing. I've talked to a number of people about it already. We need a brain bank of that kind. And long-term practitioners, after their body begins to decompose, it's typically cremated. And so I think that they would be receptive. But this is something, to the best of my knowledge, that nobody has acted on yet. It is costly to do it right. But I think it's something that really would provide enormously valuable data. And I'm happy to talk to anyone who's interested. So that's the first question. And then you asked a couple of questions about my own personal practice and what's optimal. I think that what's optimal differs for each person. I really don't, anyone who tells you that there's an optimal amount, I would be skeptical. I think that each person needs to figure out for him or herself what's optimal. And I think what's optimal for a person in different stages of their practice and in different stages of their life is likely to be different. And what's optimal even day by day is different. So, my own practice is really quite modest. I practice somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour and a half a day. And so that's what I do.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You got 2 sits or like 1 sit?
Typically one long one in the morning and then often a short one at night, but usually just in one.
Oh, hi. I had a question about the baby experiments where the babies were considered to be natively altruistic, and I would love to believe that, but I had a couple of questions about it. One is, first, I've heard other baby experiments where the amount of time they spend looking at something registers surprise. So that would be my first question. And also, if I think about things from the baby's perspective, looking at human interactions that are altruistic versus ones that are contentious, I, as a baby, might have more to gain from looking at the ones that were altruistic because it may represent more caring resources for the baby. And I just wondered about those. I was very curious about it.
Yeah, I think those are all good, healthy questions. And I think it's important to be skeptical. If the only measure was eye movements, I would also be really skeptical. But there are other kinds of converging measures besides eye movements that involve actual choice behavior. Different puppets have been used for slightly older kids, and then they're given a choice which puppet they want, and their choice, their preferences in that case are consistent with this. But it's true. I mean, they could be looking for other kinds of reasons. And so, I think that, again, there's no single method or experiment that is going to be bulletproof, and I think you have to sort of take the aggregate body, the aggregate corpus of data. And there is a growing corpus around this. It's also the case that it's not actually just in humans. There are some parallel studies that have been done in certain non-human primate species that show similar kinds of things. There's one classic experiment that Franz de Waal, who's a primatologist at Emory, did with bonobos, where one of them was fully sated, just had a meal and was full. The other one was kept hungry, really hungry. And they were confronted with with delicious food, but the only way they can get the food is if each bonobo separately pulled on a chain to bring this bowl of food closer. If one guy pulled on the chain, it didn't work. And so the hungry bonobo had to get his sated colleague to help him, purely altruistically. And it turns out that, bonobos do this very reliably. They have nothing to gain from it. They don't eat the food at all. They're doing it to help their buddy. And so there's a whole bunch of, this is now a large scientific literature. And it's true that I'm putting a particular spin on it, and there are many scientists who I think would agree with me, but there are also many who would disagree. And so this is going to be played out in the scientific literature. So thank you. Please.
Oh, it's okay. You were waiting for me. Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting talk that you delivered without a PowerPoint, which enabled me to focus more on what you were saying and not being distracted, looking all over. I appreciate that.
I feel so good to be unhinged from slides, I have to tell you.
Although I do like good PowerPoints, but this I really enjoyed that. But two things you said struck me. One, when you started your career at Harvard, you were strongly encouraged not to pursue anything that had to do with mindfulness or this field. And the second thing you said is when people were getting together at the UN thing, they wanted to talk about happiness, they consulted economic folks, And these two things represent a resistance to me to accepting what's known now, well, I don't think it's mainly people here, but they're here because they're interested in accept it. But I think there is a resistance to accepting these ideas, to talk about, to perform, and to study. I think it still exists in many communities. And I wonder what your feeling is on that. Why is it, and how you can get rid of it, and what you have to say about that resistance to it, and if you agree. I don't even know.
Yeah, no, I think there's certainly still resistance, but I must say that compared to 30 years ago, it's just a totally different ballgame now, and there's much more acceptance. This January, I was speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And I did a dialogue with Tom Insel, who is the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. I know Tom very well. He's an old friend, and I've been funded by the NIMH for years. And Tom, when our very first paper on long-term meditators came out in 2004, Tom took me aside and he said, why are you wasting your time doing this work? We need you to do other stuff, meaning traditional psychiatric research. Now I had a dialogue with him on the science of mindfulness, where he was championing this as a, as a real hopeful possibility. And so I think that, at least from where I sit, there have been rather extraordinary kinds of changes. And so yes, there are pockets of resistance, but I think the boundaries are more permeable now than they've ever been, and I think that there is there's certain kinds of evidence which I've been talking a lot about wanting to collect and just encouraging people to collect them. Here's one kind of effort that I think will be enormously influential and will really help to change things. There is a smidgen of reason to believe that people who engage in the regular practice of these kinds of practices will utilize healthcare services less, they will take prescription drugs less, and therefore their healthcare costs will go down. But that's just a conjecture at this point. There's reason to believe that it may be that way. But if it turns out in large-scale, hard-nosed, randomized controlled trials that are done in corporate settings, that when people engage in these kinds of practices to cultivate well-being, that healthcare costs go down, it's going to be like gay marriage, and the world is going to change overnight. And that study will be done. It'll be done in the next few years. And if the data point in the direction that I think they're going to point, it's going to totally be a sea change.
Thank you.
I didn't mean to disrespect you, Professor Roth. My question, two things. Do you think epigenetic evidence can be found or worthwhile for behavior like Kevin Meaney's with the rats?
Michael Meaney.
With the, I'm sorry, what?
Michael Meaney.
Michael, thank you. With the blood, using the blood.
So it's a bit of a complicated question, although I talked about this in Hal's class just before this. So what's being referred to in this question is the studies that I was alluding to, the animal studies on the behavior of a mother toward her infant, were done by a scientist by the name of Michael Meaney, who is in Montreal at McGill University. They're a classic series of studies, really important set of studies. And the question, and in those studies, it was done with rodents, and direct tissue was extracted from the brain. And the question is being asked as to whether the same kinds of studies can be done with blood. And basically the answer is yes, with some qualifications. We now have techniques to take peripheral blood mononuclear cells and convert them into pluripotent stem cells, and then once they're in the stem cell stage, they can be turned into different kinds of neurons, and you can then look at epigenetic changes when they become neurons. And so those studies are just now beginning to occur. There are no data yet from any meditation studies using these techniques. They're very expensive techniques. They make using MRI look like going to a vending machine and getting a soda. So it's going to take a while, but they'll eventually be done, and I think they're very promising technologies, but still very early.
Have you asked the Dalai Lama for his brain?
I have not. We did, the very first time the Dalai Lama came to our lab, which was in 2001, everyone was saying, you can't have him come visit the scanner room and not ask him to go into the scanner. So I knew what the answer would be. I mean, when His Holiness is in the United States in particular, it's a media zoo, and so it's fraught with all kinds of problems, and so we did not put him in the scanner.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Professor Davidson.